On the edge of a cliff, a man risked his life to save a helpless bear cub, forging a bond neither could have anticipated. Jack never expected that single act of kindness to lead to a journey filled with love, sacrifice, and heartbreak. As the cub, Rusty, grew into a majestic creature, Jack was faced with the pain of letting him go, only to have fate bring them back together in a moment that would test the limits of their trust and loyalty. A story of devotion that proves some connections are meant to last forever, no matter the cost. Jack Walker was no ordinary man. A seasoned wilderness explorer, he had spent most of his life in the heart of nature, learning its secrets and forming an unspoken bond with the wild. Living in a secluded cabin near the edge of a vast forest, Jack cherished the quiet life, far from the noise of the city. His days were spent hiking, observing wildlife, and capturing breathtaking landscapes through his camera. But little did he know that his peaceful existence was about to be shaken to its core. One crisp autumn morning, Jack set out on one of his usual hikes. The air was cool, and the forest floor was covered in a golden carpet of fallen leaves. The distant calls of birds echoed through the trees, a sound Jack had always found soothing. With his backpack slung over one shoulder and his camera in hand, he ventured deeper into the woods, blissfully unaware that fate had something extraordinary in store for him that day. As he climbed a rugged trail leading to the cliffs, Jack noticed an unusual sound, a faint cry, almost like a whimper. He paused, his heart racing. It wasn't the cry of a bird or any animal he recognized. Following the sound, he edged closer to the cliffs, where he spotted something that made his breath catch. There, on a narrow ledge halfway down the rocky wall, was a bear cub, trapped and terrified. The sight ignited a mix of emotions in Jack: fear, awe, and an overwhelming urge to help. Jack crouched near the cliff's edge, squinting to get a better look at the cub. Its soft brown fur was matted with dirt, and its tiny paws clawed desperately at the rock, trying to find footing. The cub let out another pitiful cry, its wide eyes scanning the towering cliff above. Jack's heart ached at the sight. It was helpless, and there was no sign of its mother anywhere nearby. The situation was dire. The ledge was too narrow for the cub to climb, and the fall would be fatal if it slipped. Jack scanned his surroundings, thinking fast. He had no rope, no harness, just his backpack with basic supplies. He knew the climb would be dangerous, but there was no time to hesitate. Taking a deep breath, Jack braced himself and began his descent, gripping the jagged rocks carefully as he went. The cub froze when Jack got closer, its cries silencing into a soft whimper. It was clear the little creature was frightened, but Jack spoke in a calm, soothing tone. "It's okay, little one. I'm here to help." Slowly, he reached the ledge, positioning himself beside the cub. The tiny bear flinched at first, but seemed to sense Jack meant no harm. With careful hands, Jack wrapped his jacket around the cub and secured it tightly to his chest. Climbing back up with the extra weight was twice as hard, but Jack pushed through, fueled by determination. By the time they reached the top, Jack was breathless and covered in dirt, but he smiled as he set the cub down gently on the ground. The bear looked up at him, as if in gratitude, and for a moment the two shared an unspoken connection. Little did Jack know, saving this cub would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The relief of reaching the top of the cliff was short-lived. Jack quickly realized the cub wasn't just scared. It was weak and trembling, likely from exhaustion or hunger. The little bear let out a faint whimper, its small body shaking as it leaned against Jack's leg. He gently patted its head, his fingers brushing against its soft fur. "You're okay now, buddy. Let's get you somewhere safe," he murmured. Jack scanned the forest, half expecting to see the mother bear storming out of the trees in a fit of rage. But the woods were silent, save for the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. It was odd. Bears rarely left their cubs alone, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Still, there was no time to dwell on it. He picked up the cub, cradling it carefully in his arms, and began the hike back to his cabin. The journey back wasn't easy. Jack had to keep his wits about him, constantly scanning for any signs of danger, whether from the cub's mother or predators drawn by its cries. The weight of the cub slowed him down, but Jack didn't mind. He could feel its tiny heart beating rapidly against his chest, a reminder of just how fragile life could be. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the forest. Jack set the cub down on a blanket near the fireplace, making sure it was comfortable. As the fire crackled and the cub began to relax, Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. He had saved a life today, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Something about this little bear felt different, like it was meant to cross his path. And soon, Jack would discover just how true that was. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of soft scratching. Opening his eyes, he saw the bear cub wandering around his cabin, curiously sniffing at the furniture and the gear stacked near the door. Jack chuckled, sitting up slowly to avoid startling it. "Looks like you're feeling better," he said, his voice light and warm. The cub turned to look at him, its dark eyes glinting with curiosity. Jack reached out a hand cautiously, and to his surprise, the cub padded over, nuzzling its nose against his palm. A smile spread across Jack's face. He wasn't sure if the cub understood his intentions, but it seemed to trust him completely now. Over the next few days, Jack took care of the cub, feeding it a mixture of milk and mashed fruits he had on hand. He even gave it a name, Rusty, inspired by the reddish-brown tint in its fur. As the days turned into weeks, Rusty and Jack grew inseparable. Rusty followed Jack everywhere, whether he was chopping wood, fishing by the creek, or just sitting on the porch enjoying the forest breeze. Jack found himself talking to Rusty like a friend, sharing stories and thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. And though Rusty couldn't respond, the bear's attentive eyes and playful gestures made Jack feel understood in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. But as much as Jack cherished the bond they were building, he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Rusty was a wild animal, and eventually he would need to return to the forest. Jack just didn't know when or how to let go. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, Jack noticed something odd. Rusty, who usually curled up near the fireplace, was pacing near the cabin door, letting out soft, low grunts. At first, Jack thought Rusty might be hungry, but the food he offered was ignored. Instead, the cub kept sniffing the air, its small ears twitching as if it could hear something Jack couldn't. "What's wrong, buddy?" Jack asked, kneeling down to meet Rusty's eyes. The bear turned to him briefly, then resumed pacing, clearly agitated. Jack stepped outside to investigate, his flashlight cutting through the dark woods. The air felt heavy, and there was an eerie stillness in the forest. Even the usual chirping of crickets seemed muted. Jack's gut told him something wasn't right. The next morning, Rusty's strange behavior continued. This time, the cub wandered around the edge of the cabin, clawing at the ground and letting out soft growls. Jack watched carefully, noting how focused Rusty seemed. It was almost as if the bear was trying to warn him about something. But what? Jack decided to trust Rusty's instincts. He began to inspect the area around the cabin and soon found something chilling, a set of deep boot prints leading from the woods and stopping near his back window. Someone had been here, watching. Jack's pulse quickened as he examined the boot prints outside his cabin. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth as though someone had been there just hours ago. A wave of unease washed over him. Who would venture this deep into the forest, and why would they be lurking near his cabin? Rusty, still restless, followed Jack as he began surveying the area for more clues. That's when Jack noticed something even more unsettling: broken branches and scuffed dirt trails leading deeper into the woods. He hesitated. Going after the tracks might reveal answers, but it could also lead him into trouble. The thought of leaving Rusty unprotected at the cabin made him uneasy, so he decided to return inside and secure the place for the night. As the hours passed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Rusty, too, remained on high alert, occasionally growling at the shadows outside the window. Jack sat by the fire, stroking the cub's fur and whispering softly, "Don't worry, buddy. We'll figure this out." But in his heart, Jack knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger threat. The following day, Jack woke to find Rusty already at the door, pawing at the wooden frame as if eager to go outside. It wasn't normal behavior for the cub, who usually stayed close to Jack. Curious, Jack decided to follow Rusty's lead, grabbing his gear and stepping into the crisp morning air. Rusty led him into the forest, moving with surprising determination for such a small bear. Jack was amazed at how the cub seemed to know exactly where to go. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing where Jack found something shocking: animal traps. Rusty growled at the sight, and Jack's stomach churned with anger. These weren't ordinary traps. They were large and brutal, designed to maim. Jack carefully disarmed one of the traps, his mind racing. "Poachers," he muttered under his breath. He had heard stories of illegal hunting in the area, but had never encountered it himself. Rusty had somehow sensed the danger before Jack had, and the realization deepened their bond. From that moment on, Jack knew he wasn't just protecting Rusty. Rusty was protecting him too. Later that night, Jack was jolted awake by the sound of heavy footsteps outside the cabin. Rusty's growls confirmed his worst fear. Someone was approaching. Grabbing his flashlight and a sturdy wooden staff, Jack opened the door to confront whoever was out there. Two shadowy figures stood at the edge of the clearing, armed and scanning the area with flashlights of their own. They were poachers, no doubt looking for the traps Jack had disarmed earlier. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped forward, calling out, "This is private property. Leave now." The men exchanged glances, clearly unfazed. "We're just passing through," one of them replied, though his tone carried a threat. Before Jack could respond, Rusty stepped into the light, growling fiercely. The sight of the cub seemed to surprise the poachers, who muttered something under their breath before retreating into the woods. Though the immediate danger had passed, Jack knew it wouldn't be the last time he saw them. He tightened his grip on the staff, vowing to protect Rusty and the forest at all costs. Over the next few days, Jack began preparing for the worst. He set up barriers around the cabin and kept an eye out for any signs of the poachers' return. Meanwhile, Rusty seemed to sense Jack's worry and began displaying behavior that stunned him. One afternoon, as Jack was inspecting the traps he had confiscated, Rusty started digging near a pile of leaves. Curious, Jack went over to see what the cub had found. Beneath the foliage was a hidden camera, likely placed there by the poachers to monitor the area. Jack stared at Rusty in disbelief. "You're smarter than I thought," he said with a grin. Rusty continued to prove his worth in the days that followed, leading Jack to other hidden traps and cameras. It was as though the cub had a natural instinct for detecting danger. Together, they became an unlikely team, working to protect the forest from those who sought to harm it. As days turned into weeks, Jack and Rusty became inseparable. Their bond had grown beyond what Jack thought possible with a wild animal. Rusty wasn't just a cub anymore. He was a companion, and in some ways, a protector. Jack found himself opening up to Rusty in ways he hadn't with anyone before. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jack shared stories from his past, his love for nature, the struggles of living alone, and how the wilderness had always been his escape. Rusty listened, his big eyes locked on Jack as if he understood every word. It was during these moments that Jack realized he had found a purpose beyond simply existing in the forest. He was no longer alone, but Jack also knew this couldn't last forever. Rusty was growing quickly, and his instincts were starting to kick in. Soon, he would need to return to the wild where he belonged. The thought of letting Rusty go was bittersweet, but Jack pushed it aside, determined to make the most of their time together. One afternoon, Jack decided to follow the tracks he had discovered earlier. With Rusty by his side, He ventured deeper into the forest, moving cautiously to avoid detection. The tracks led them to an open clearing where Jack found evidence of the poachers' activities: discarded traps, ropes, and even animal pelts. The sight made Jack's blood boil. These weren't just hunters. They were ruthless and organized. He took photos of the evidence with his camera, planning to report it to the authorities. Rusty, too, seemed agitated, sniffing the ground and growling softly. Jack placed a hand on the cub's back, whispering, "We'll stop them, buddy." "I promise." Before they could leave, the sound of approaching voices forced Jack to hide behind a tree. Two men entered the clearing, laughing and carrying a fresh kill. Jack's heart pounded as he quietly signaled Rusty to stay hidden. The poachers were more dangerous than he had imagined, and Jack knew he had to act carefully if he wanted to bring them down. Back at the cabin, Jack began devising a plan. He needed more evidence to stop the poachers, but he couldn't risk confronting them directly. That's when he noticed something remarkable about Rusty. The cub had started mimicking Jack's movements, almost as if he were learning from him. Jack decided to test Rusty's abilities. He set up a mock trap near the cabin and watched as Rusty carefully avoided it, using his nose and paws to disarm it. Jack was amazed. "You're a genius, Rusty," he said, laughing. It was clear that the bear's instincts, combined with what he had learned from Jack, made him an invaluable ally. Over the next few days, Jack and Rusty worked together to find and disable more traps. Rusty's sharp senses led them to hidden caches the poachers had left behind. Each discovery brought them closer to understanding the poachers' operations and how to stop them for good. One stormy night, Jack woke to the sound of glass shattering. Someone had broken into the cabin. Rusty let out a fierce growl, and Jack grabbed the nearest weapon, a hunting knife, as he moved to confront the intruders. Two poachers stood in the doorway, their faces shadowed by the flickering firelight. "We warned you to stay out of our business," one of them snarled, pointing a rifle at Jack. Rusty stepped forward, growling louder, but Jack raised a hand to hold him back. "You're trespassing," Jack said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." The poachers laughed, but before they could take another step, Rusty lunged forward, his teeth bared. The men panicked, stumbling backward as the cub's sudden aggression caught them off guard. Jack took the opportunity to shove them out of the cabin and barricade the door. As the storm raged outside, Jack and Rusty sat together, both shaken but unharmed. It was clear now. The poachers weren't going to stop, and Jack had to find a way to end this once and for all. The next morning, Jack decided to go on the offensive. With Rusty leading the way, they followed the trail left by the poachers to an old abandoned shed deep in the forest. Inside, Jack found several cages filled with captured animals: foxes, raccoons, and even a young deer. Rusty growled at the sight, his instincts flaring. Jack quickly got to work, breaking the locks and freeing the terrified creatures. As they fled into the forest, Jack snapped photos of the shed and its contents, determined to use the evidence to bring the poachers to justice. But their mission wasn't over yet. Jack knew the poachers would return, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. Jack decided it was time to share his story. He contacted a local wildlife organization and shared the photos and evidence he had gathered. To his surprise, the story quickly gained traction, drawing attention from news outlets and environmental groups. The media dubbed Jack the Forest Guardian, and Rusty became a symbol of hope for wildlife conservation. Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing his efforts were making a difference. But with the increased attention came increased danger. The poachers were now desperate to silence him, and Jack had to stay one step ahead. Jack knew that the only way to stop the poachers for good was to catch them in the act. With help from the wildlife organization, he devised a plan to lure the poachers into a trap. The group provided Jack with tracking devices and cameras to monitor the area while he prepared bait near one of the forest's main paths. Rusty played an important role in the operation. Using his heightened senses, the cub helped Jack locate fresh signs of poacher activity. Together, They set up decoy traps and planted cameras in strategic locations. Jack was careful to stay hidden, watching from a distance as the forest remained eerily quiet. The poachers didn't show up that night, but Jack wasn't discouraged. He knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. As the hours dragged on, Jack and Rusty sat together in the cover of thick bushes. The bond between them had grown unshakable, and Jack found himself marveling at how much Rusty had grown, both in size and intelligence. Just before dawn, the sound of voices broke the silence. Jack's heart raced as he spotted two figures approaching the bait. He gripped his camera tightly, ready to capture the evidence that would finally put an end to their illegal activities. Rusty, sensing Jack's tension, stayed perfectly still beside him, his dark eyes locked on the intruders. This time, Jack was ready. The poachers moved cautiously toward the bait, their flashlights scanning the area. Jack remained hidden, his breathing shallow as he watched them inspect the scene. One of them knelt down to examine the bait, muttering something to his partner. Jack couldn't hear what they were saying, but their frustration was clear. They knew someone had been interfering with their operations. As the poachers began setting up a trap of their own, Jack sprang into action. With a swift motion, he activated a preset alarm that echoed through the forest, startling the men. Rusty, following Jack's cue, let out a loud roar, his deep growl echoing off the trees. The poachers panicked, dropping their tools and scrambling to retreat. But Jack wasn't letting them get away this time. He stepped out of his hiding spot, his flashlight trained on them. "This ends now," he called out firmly. Caught off guard, the poachers froze, their faces pale. Before they could react, Jack's wildlife team, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, emerged to block their escape. The poachers were outnumbered and cornered. With the poachers apprehended, Jack and the team handed over the evidence to the local authorities. The operation had been a success, and the men were taken into custody. Jack felt a deep sense of relief as the police assured him that the illegal trapping ring would be thoroughly investigated. Rusty, now a local hero, received plenty of attention from the media and conservationists. Jack couldn't help but smile as reporters asked about the cub's role in the operation. "He's not just a bear," Jack told them. "He's my partner." But even as the world celebrated their victory, Jack knew this was only part of the journey. Rusty had proven his loyalty and intelligence, but the time was fast approaching for him to return to the wild. As the weeks passed, Jack began preparing for the inevitable. Rusty had grown considerably, his playful antics giving way to the instincts of a young bear ready to explore the world. Jack knew it was unfair to keep Rusty confined to the cabin, no matter how much he cared for him. Jack reached out to a nearby wildlife reserve, explaining Rusty's story and asking for guidance. The experts assured him that Rusty's bond with Jack wouldn't prevent him from adapting to life in the wild. "Bears are resilient," they told him. "He'll thrive out there." The thought of letting Rusty go was painful, but Jack focused on making the transition as smooth as possible. He began taking Rusty on longer hikes, teaching him to forage for food and avoid human contact. Each trip brought them closer to the moment Jack had been dreading. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the forest, as Jack prepared for the moment he had been dreading. Rusty, now nearly as tall as Jack's chest when he stood on his hind legs, seemed to sense something different about the day. He followed Jack closely as they walked the familiar trails one last time. Jack stopped at a secluded clearing near the wildlife reserve, a spot he had chosen carefully for its abundant food sources and access to water. He turned to Rusty, his heart heavy. "This is your home now, buddy," Jack said, his voice trembling. "This is where you belong." Rusty tilted his head, his dark eyes watching Jack intently. Jack knelt down, resting his forehead against the bear's broad head. "You're going to be amazing out here," he whispered. "You've got everything you need to survive. And more." For a moment, Rusty stayed still, his breathing slow and steady. Then, as if understanding what Jack was trying to say, the bear gave a soft grunt and stepped back. Jack fought back tears as he watched Rusty turn toward the trees, his powerful frame moving gracefully into the forest. Just before disappearing into the shadows, Rusty paused and looked back, letting out a low, mournful sound. Jack raised a hand in farewell, his voice cracking as he said, "Goodbye, Rusty." The bear lingered for a moment before vanishing into the wilderness. Jack stood there long after Rusty was gone, the weight of the goodbye settling over him like the quiet of the forest. Returning to the cabin felt like stepping into a hollow shell of his former life. The once cozy space now seemed too quiet, too still. Jack kept glancing at Rusty's favorite spots, the blanket by the fireplace, the corner where the cub used to nap. But they were empty now. The first few days were the hardest. Jack found himself waking up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear Rusty's playful growls or the soft patting of his paws. The forest, which had always been a place of peace for Jack, now felt vast and lonely. To cope with the emptiness, Jack threw himself into his work. He continued to dismantle traps and report illegal poaching activities, determined to honor the bond he had shared with Rusty by protecting other animals like him. He also began documenting his experience, writing down everything he had learned from his time with the bear. Though the pain of separation lingered, Jack found comfort in the knowledge that Rusty was out there, thriving in the wild where he belonged. And deep down, he hoped their paths would cross again someday. Weeks turned into months, and while life without Rusty was difficult, Jack found himself with a renewed sense of purpose. The story of his bond with the bear had gained national attention, and conservation groups began reaching out to him for help with their efforts to protect wildlife. One such group invited Jack to join a campaign aimed at educating locals about the importance of preserving forest ecosystems. Jack saw this as an opportunity not only to honor Rusty, but to ensure no other animals had to suffer because of poachers. Jack traveled to nearby towns, sharing his experiences with Rusty and how they worked together to combat illegal trapping. His story inspired people, particularly children, who admired the bond between the man and the bear. Jack felt fulfilled in ways he hadn't in years, realizing that Rusty had given him more than just companionship. He had given Jack a cause to fight for. But even as Jack's new mission gained momentum, he couldn't shake the longing to see Rusty again. He often found himself wandering the forest trails, hoping for a glimpse of the bear who had changed his life forever. One crisp autumn morning, Jack decided to hike to the clearing where he had last seen Rusty. The forest had changed with the seasons, the trees now ablaze with red and gold leaves. As Jack walked, he noticed signs that made his heart race. Claw marks on a tree, overturned logs, and large paw prints in the damp earth. Could it be him? Jack wondered aloud, his voice tinged with hope. Rusty had grown considerably before they parted ways, and the size of the prints seemed to match. As Jack followed the trail, he came upon a familiar sight, a pile of rocks arranged near a tree. It was something he and Rusty had done together during their training, a game to hone the bear's problem-solving skills. Jack knelt down, his heart swelling with emotion. Rusty was out there, and he hadn't forgotten their bond. Jack spent hours in the clearing, hoping for a reunion. Though Rusty didn't appear, Jack left with a renewed sense of connection, knowing the bear was thriving in his natural habitat. Jack's peaceful life was interrupted one evening when a ranger from the wildlife reserve arrived at his cabin with troubling news. "We've spotted increased poacher activity near the northern boundary," the ranger said. "They're targeting larger animals, including bears." The thought of Rusty being in danger reignited Jack's protective instincts. He immediately volunteered to help the reserve track and deter the poachers. Armed with his knowledge of the forest and the poachers' tactics, Jack led a team of rangers to monitor the area. Rusty's training came back to Jack in unexpected ways. As he scanned the forest for signs of traps, he thought of the skills the cub had taught him. How to notice disturbances in the ground or broken branches that indicated danger. Jack realized that Rusty had prepared him for this moment, even in his absence. While patrolling one evening, Jack heard a low growl echoing through the trees. His heart skipped a beat. It was unmistakably a bear, but could it be Rusty? Gripping his flashlight tightly, Jack followed the sound, moving cautiously through the dense forest. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sounds of heavy footsteps. Jack froze as a massive figure emerged from the shadows, a fully grown bear with a strikingly familiar gait. It was Rusty. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Rusty had grown into a powerful, majestic bear, but his eyes still held the same warmth Jack remembered. For a moment, man and bear stood still, locked in silent recognition. Rusty let out a soft grunt, a sound Jack had heard countless times before. Before Jack could take a step closer, Rusty turned and disappeared into the woods. Jack smiled, his heart full. Rusty was alive and thriving, and that was all he needed to know. The next morning, Jack returned to the spot where he had seen Rusty. There, he found something unusual, a freshly dug patch of earth near a tree. It wasn't a coincidence. Rusty had been trying to tell him something. Jack dug through the loose soil and found another animal trap hidden just beneath the surface. Rusty had remembered their training, warning Jack of the danger. The realization brought tears to Jack's eyes. Even after all this time, their bond remained unbroken. Jack dismantled the trap and decided to redouble his efforts to stop the poachers. The reserve team, inspired by Jack's dedication and Rusty's intelligence, ramped up their patrols. Together, they worked tirelessly to secure the forest, ensuring it would remain a safe haven for all its inhabitants. As Jack and the reserve rangers intensified their efforts, the poachers became more aggressive. One evening, while patrolling near the forest's northern boundary, Jack and his team heard gunshots echoing through the trees. They moved quickly, their hearts pounding, fearing the worst. The group reached a clearing where they found fresh signs of a struggle: broken branches, claw marks, and blood. Jack's stomach churned as he scanned the area for any signs of Rusty. The thought of his old friend being hurt or worse filled him with dread. The poachers weren't far. Jack spotted them setting up a large trap meant for a bear. It was clear they were after something big, and Jack knew Rusty might be their target. With the rangers at his side, Jack decided it was time to confront them directly. They crept closer, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Before Jack and the rangers could make their move, a deafening roar shattered the silence. From the shadows, Rusty charged into the clearing, his massive form a blur of power and fury. The poachers scrambled, their weapons raised, but Rusty was too fast. He knocked over their equipment with ease, his growls echoing through the forest. Jack's heart raced as he watched the bear he had raised defend his territory. The rangers quickly joined the fray, surrounding the poachers and disarming them before they could harm Rusty. Jack called out to the bear, his voice steady but firm. "Rusty, it's okay. We've got this." Rusty paused, his chest heaving as he stared at Jack. Slowly, the bear backed away, allowing the rangers to take control. The poachers were handcuffed and led out of the forest, their reign of terror finally over. With the poachers defeated, the forest was once again safe. News of Rusty's bravery and Jack's relentless dedication spread far and wide, turning their story into a symbol of hope and resilience. Conservation groups rallied behind Jack, using his bond with Rusty to raise awareness about the importance of protecting wildlife. Jack often returned to the clearing where he had last seen Rusty, hoping for another encounter. He knew Rusty had fulfilled his role as both a protector and a friend, but the longing to see him again never truly went away. One day, Jack found fresh paw prints leading to a nearby stream. Though he never spotted Rusty, he knew the bear was still watching over the forest. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of peace. Rusty's legacy would live on, inspiring others to care for the wilderness and its creatures. Years passed, but Jack remained deeply connected to the forest. He had become a local legend, known as the man who raised a bear and helped save an entire ecosystem. His cabin had become a small conservation hub where visitors came to learn about the forest and hear the story of Rusty. One quiet morning, Jack woke to a familiar sound, a deep, rumbling growl coming from outside the cabin. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped onto the porch. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Rusty. He was larger than Jack had ever seen, his fur thick, and his eyes filled with the same warmth from their years together. Jack didn't move, letting the moment wash over him. Rusty let out a soft grunt, as if to say goodbye one last time, before turning and disappearing into the forest. Jack stood there, tears streaming down his face, grateful for the gift of seeing his old friend once more. Rusty was home, and so was Jack.